Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today folks, I'm hoping this is going to be a very interesting video, but there will be quite a long introduction here, so I'll put a timestamp on screen now to where you can skip straight to the playing if you want to, that's absolutely fine, but I do need to add some context to really make this comparison make sense. So, vintage guitars and chasing vintage tone. There's a huge amount of rabbit holes involved in that the likes of me spend our lives jumping headfirst into. And it's a concept applicable to most vintage style guitars up to a point, but it's especially widely discussed with regard to burst Les Pauls. Gibson Les Paul standards of 1958, 59 and 1960. Now here I have my 1992 Gibson Les Paul standard. Very good sounding guitar. It's said that the early 90s was a particularly good era of wood for building Les Pauls out of, but it's nothing special in terms of being a historic reissue like an R8 or an R9. It's just a very good middle-aged sunburst Les Paul. But I have made changes to this guitar to take it to kind of early burst spec up to a point anyway. So the pickups in here are the throwback SLE 101s, very accurate, super nerdy reproductions of the earliest Alnico 2 PAFs, but they sound astonishing in this guitar. The tailpiece is a very lightweight aluminium tailpiece, like the bursts would have had, and this is a Faber ABR1 reproduction bridge. Now, I believe from memory it was Dave Stevens who I heard talking about this, I could be wrong, but I think he said that the Fabers certainly aren't made the same as the original ABR1s, but they're some of the closest sounding on the market in terms of pure sonics, which is why I fitted one to this guitar. Now, internally, I use VIPots, which are the Centralab replica pots, and that's going to become very important very soon. And I wire them together using the 50s wiring schematic and Lux paper in oil Bumblebee reproduction capacitors, which, depending on who you ask, do or don't make a difference, but they're historically correct at least. Now, there are other changes I could have made to this guitar, like reproduction tuners and things, but these are the sort of changes that felt appropriate to make to a guitar that isn't a historic reissue. I've taken it to sort of burst spec up to a point, but it doesn't seem much point going further unless you get the kind of the exact woods right and the construction methods right and all that sort of stuff. But it's a wonderful sounding guitar. Now, going back to the potentiometers, the VIPots are replicas of Centralab pots, which is what was fitted to the original bursts. And if you're speccing up a burster like nowadays, you kind of have two different options to get that right. Firstly, you can use the reproductions. CTS in conjunction with bare knuckle pickups also make a Centralab replica pot. Or you can try and find some vintage originals. Now those are incredibly hard to find, and if you can find one, they are astronomical money. A single pot will run you $500 plus, so huge amounts of cash. But those are your kind of two options to do it right. But there is now a third way. Enter Taylor Spears from Texas, USA, otherwise known as Nostalgic, and I'll put a link in the description underneath to his reverb shop where you can find out more about these if you want to. Now, back in the day, Centralab pots didn't just end up in electric guitars. They made pots for lots of different things. Cars, televisions, radios, everything. And those other pots were typically much bigger. But what people have figured out in recent years is that the internals of those pots, like the wiper and the carbon track, are identical to what was put in the Les Pauls. So if you look at this harness, you'll see that they are long shaft pots and the back of them say CTS. So you would assume these are 500k CTS pots laid out for a left-handed Gibson Les Paul, but they're not. Internally, these have the internals of vintage Centralab pots that have been taken out of those bigger enclosures and housed in the smaller CTS enclosures to fit in a Les Paul. So these are hybrid pots. And if there is anything in those vintage original pots that make a burst sound as it does, we should hear it with these. So why is it important? Well, it depends who you listen to, but one person I've heard speak at length about this over the years is Joe Bonamassa. Now, like him or loathe him, you don't have to like his playing, but he's certainly an authority on vintage instruments. And there's an interview floating around, I think it was with Guitarist magazine, it's on YouTube, it's a few years old now, where he's talking about the electronics of his bursts. And he says that the PAF pickups are only 50% of the sound. The pots are the other 50% of the sound, and they are very important to how the Les Paul comes across. Now, in terms of taper, as I said, certain companies do match the taper nowadays, so you almost don't have to worry about that side of things. And also they match the value. Now, if you take a burst Les Paul nowadays and measure the pot values, typically they read in the kind of 530, 540k region. And Taylor has an interesting idea about why that is, and it does make sense in terms of physics. As you use a pot over the years, the carbon track does begin to wear. And when you take that material away, the resistance of the pot will go up. So whereas nowadays a burst pot will read at 540, originally 60 years ago it was probably a 500k pot. It's just worn and the value's gone up. So interesting to note that, but people making Centralab reproduction pots nowadays do typically have them as 550k. So you can match the taper and you can match the value. But the real talking point about Centralab pots is the carbon tracks. Now, I'm going to put a photo on screen now of these exact pots when Taylor was building them for me, and you'll see the original CTS internals that have been taken out and the Centralab internals that have been put in. And you can see that the Centralab carbon tracks are much thicker and have a much bigger circumference in terms of where the wiper moves. And that's what people say make the difference. So what I'm going to do today, folks, is I'm going to play a few things on my Les Paul through a few classic tube amp circuits. So an AC30 type thing for some clean playing, an orange picks only thing for some crunch, and then just a cranked JTM45 for the howling blues breaker type sound at the end. Then take the VIPots out. Nothing else about the guitar is going to change. The pickups won't be touched. It'll be the same set of strings. Everything will be the same. But I'm going to put in the nostalgic Centralab pots and play the same things through the same amps and see if these really do change the sound of the guitar. Now, of course, there will be slight differences in the actual measured values of the pots. I'm going to measure the pots that are in the guitar now and measure the exact values of these and put them on screen. So you will know that any slight differences in high end could be down to differences in the pots. And the other thing that's important to point out at this point is, it won't surprise you to learn that as more people have cottoned on to this concept of hybrid pots over the years, logarithmic taper tracks are much harder to come by than linear. So these are linear taper pots, which is going to present us with a few problems if we're rolling the knobs back, which is important to do. So what I'm going to do is measure the VI pots and find a point on the knob where they match the linear taper. So I'm going to guess that 8 on a log pot will be approximately 4 or 5 on a linear pot. I will put that on screen so we can experiment with rolling the pots back, even though they are different tapers. So the knobs will be in different positions, but the actual reading of the pot will be the same, if that makes any sense. So we do need to take that into account. As I said, I will put that on screen. But I'm genuinely excited to find out what the result of this video is, because as you can see, I haven't put these in my guitar yet. So I really want to know whether there's anything in this mystique of vintage Centralab pots or not. So without further ado, folks, here we go. there we are, folks. Now, please do comment underneath, let me know what you were hearing today. Did you prefer one set of pots over the other, and why? Were you hearing big differences, small differences, no difference? I love chatting nerdy guitar stuff with you folks down in the comments section. Now, having just quickly listened back to what I've recorded today and flicked between the various excerpts, there are a couple of differences that I'm hearing between those two sets of pots. Now, they're not big differences whatsoever, but let's be honest, subtleties are what tone chasing is usually all about, right? Now, difference number one was, I think the nostalgic pots sounded slightly louder than the VI pots, or at least they're letting more of the pickup signal through into the amp than the VI pots are. Because when I set up the Dr. Z Z-Rec for the first bit of playing, I set it really loud but still clean. But when I put the nostalgic pots in the guitar, in a few places it was starting to get pushed into breakup. So we were getting a little bit more signal through the nostalgic pots than the VI pots. That was difference number one. And number two was a slight EQ change. And again, it's not a major one. But to my ears, the VI pots had a slightly thicker, boxy, lower mid-range to them. And the nostalgic pots had slightly more kind of fizz and bite in the upper mid-range. Now, there's various things you could do to achieve either of those tonal changes if you wanted to. You could re-EQ the amp, use a pedal, adjust your pickup height, change your strings. All of that stuff would probably create more of a difference in terms of EQ than we got from the pots. But the differences were definitely there. And when I think about the classic burst sounds, I don't think of them as being sort of really barky in the lower mid-range. That's more of a modern Les Paul thing. But I do think of them, especially the later kind of 59 and 60 burst sounds, with that kind of aggression and bite in the upper mid-range. So did the nostalgic pots make my Les Paul sound more like a burst? Arguably, yes, a little bit, because those EQ changes are what I associate with classic burst tone. But again, they're very small changes and there are other things you could do to achieve something similar. Now, with the bridge pickup volume and tone pots, just quite by chance, to be honest, the values between the two sets were almost exactly the same. But with the neck pickup, the nostalgic pot values were a fair bit higher than the VI pot. So that might have been playing into it with a little bit of extra clarity in the neck pickup. We can't rule that out. And of course, I can't compare the taper really between them because we're comparing a log set of pots to a linear set of pots. But I did find that nice happy place. 7 on the VI pots, which is the log taper, was almost exactly the same in terms of measuring the pot with a multimeter as 4 on the linear pots. I think it was 4.3 it worked out as, so a smidge above 4. And so we could compare them sort of rolling off the volume. I do also think that the VI pots, despite being a little bit less bitey in the upper mid-range than the nostalgics, retained a bit more clarity as I was rolling the volume off. So please do let me know if you agree with that as well. But, you know, we are talking subtleties, but as I said, that is what tone chasing is all about. So please do comment underneath, folks. I love getting your thoughts and opinions in the comments section. I'm genuinely excited to hear your thoughts on everything you've heard today. I really cannot wait to get your opinions on it. So thank you ever so much for watching, folks. I hope this video was interesting and useful for you. As I said at the start, I've put a link in the description to Nostalgic's Reverb Shop if you want to read all about these hybrid pots and find out more about them or get some for yourself. So thanks, folks. Please do carry on subscribing. I know I always say it, but it makes a big, big difference when you do that. And I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.